There you go. Okay. So Ravi, I've as I said, I've known you for quite some time and followed you from Harvard Business School to Cummins Engine to Microsoft. And, there was a pretty clear sort of narrative and trajectory. And, you had reached this position as the CEO and chairman of Microsoft India, which was, a quite remarkable position, Microsoft being an extraordinarily well-admired global company. It wasn't just on the business front, it was a platform for doing some wonderful things for India as well, which I know was part of really your agenda. And then you made this decision to leave Microsoft in, I guess, 2011. You were, I guess, just not quite 50 at that point. And certainly, so say more about why did you choose to leave? Why did you make that decision? What was that choice about for you?
Yeah, first of all, I made that decision when I was 47. And there were a couple of reasons. One is, as I'm sure by now, Russ, everybody has seen Steve Jobs' Stanford commencement speech. And there are many nuggets out there, but one of the things Steve says is, if for too many days in a row you wake up not enjoying what you do, then it's time to do something different. And I had spent about a year and a half not enjoying mostly what I was doing, and more importantly, the context in which I was doing it. So that was one major factor. And just because it's such a cozy job with, well remunerated, big title, all that, it's not good, felt no longer good enough reason to stay on. The second thing is I was conscious that, I was 47 and perhaps that's still not too old, but there's no guarantee that I was going to live on to retire at 60, then do all the things I wish to do. I began to sense my own mortality, seeing other people around me, die early or, become unwell or whatever. So I said, look, while I still have the capacity to do what I want to get on with it. So I found myself at a place where I was staying on at Microsoft for all the wrong reasons. And one day it felt like, it's time to get out of the nest and explore new things. I had no idea what I wanted to do at that time. And in my book, I say we'll all likely get to a point where you don't enjoy what you're doing, but you have no idea what else you wish to do and sort of linger on. And I decided I was going to take my chances and do a bunch of experiments and see, how things would turn out. So that's exactly how it played out.
So Ravi, it's quite remarkable, sort of jumping out of the airplane, not quite knowing that you had a parachute to open up at that point as you went forward. Say something about that transition? I mean, was it a difficult transition for you? What was challenging? In what ways? What were the challenges that you saw? How did you kind of navigate it?
You were there alongside me in that transition, Russ, and it was very difficult because the thing about a good job is that it gives you a lot of different things. The money and income is just one part of it. Turns out identity is a large part of what you get. So, if you're not chairman of Microsoft or whatever, who are you? How do you introduce yourself to strangers? So that was a big problem because of my significant professional success, I had conflated my identity with my employment. I mean, they were inseparable. And that was a particularly difficult one. There was a big worry about, if I'm not this person, how am I going to be relevant? I don't know why I had this need to be relevant to the world and society. It was delusional, but it was a very strong delusion. And in fact, I as I began to wean myself of that, I wrote a series of 4 articles in a major Indian newspaper called The Fear of Being Nobody. It was a 4-part series, and anybody who's interested can look for that. But it got about 15 million views over the years. And so I realized I wasn't alone. So that was it. Then, I would get up in the morning, everybody would go to work, my wife would go to work, and I was still in my pajamas at 10 o'clock. And I, began to feel sorry for myself, and said maybe I should just quit this experiment and go back to finding a good job and being normal. So many times when you lose courage, yeah, so it was not easy. It's like any de-addiction, I think. Um, so when you leave the comfort of the routines and the community you're part of, etc., and you strike out on your own, it's very uncomfortable, very lonely for a while. I did jump. I didn't. It's not fair to say I jumped without a parachute. I did have a couple of things going for me. One is I had a few people around me who encouraged me very strongly to stay on the path. My wife Sonali was one of those. Friends like you were others. I think it's very important to have that tight community that's supporting you as you go down on this path of adventure. The second thing is I had a board which gave me some identity, and a reasonable income. So not that the income was that important, but it psychologically felt better. I had my book project, my first book project, so there was some purpose. So just researching that book and writing gave me something to do every day. So there were these guardrails and safety net, if you will. So it wasn't completely leaping out without a parachute. But still, it felt pretty uncomfortable for a good 2 or 3 years.
Mm. So Ravi, I'm really interested. You used a phrase, kind of the illusion of relevance. And I find that an interesting comment, particularly given how much you've engaged in the social sector in a variety of ways. Just to say a bit more what you mean by that.
Yeah. Look, if you do something important, you do work that is important, or you're part of an important institution like a hospital or a company or whatever, you can get very confused about and think that it's you who's important. There was, when I went to, I joined Microsoft in 2003. I was kind of stunned because every person thought he was Bill Gates or she was Bill Gates. Okay. And they acted that way. You just happen to work at Microsoft. And so, yeah, you begin to take yourself seriously. And real problem. And you have to, I began to realize through this process that, I was irrelevant. From time to time, you do work that is relevant. You're part of an institution that is relevant, but don't conflate the two. And I actually had a pretty rude awakening one day. In India, the company gives you a car and you're chauffeured to work. And when you get to work, the guards salute smartly, and you begin to think you're really important. One day I drove myself to work, and the guard said, "Who the heck are you?" And I realized they were saluting the car. And that was a wonderful moment, which I haven't forgotten. And so I think you have to work consciously to make this separation between yourself, the work you do, which may or may not be all that consequential, the institution you're part of, etc. And then gradually you realize we're all, in a sense, irrelevant. We're destined to be forgotten. But it's one thing to sort of intellectually understand that, and it's an entirely different thing for it to permeate your being. So it took a good decade to get there, even after the light bulb turned on. So Ravi, I really no longer aspire to be important. I aspire to do work that is very useful. And I think it's way more liberating.
Mm. So Ravi, I want to kind of explore this, and we'll kind of go into this in more depth a bit later on. But you talked about making this transition. That you had some guide rails. There were a couple of projects that helped to bridge the gap. But how did you decide where to focus your energy and your efforts? I mean, what did you say yes to, and what did you say no to? I mean, one of the things I know about you is that you like to say yes, right? I mean, that over the years, you've got a lot of energy and a lot of talent and so on. So how did you think about how to focus your time and your efforts?
I didn't. So one of the things I encourage people to do when you're in this situation where you don't know exactly what you want to do next, don't exactly know your path forward, is to try many things. And that's what I did. I experimented.
Ravi, I'm sorry, one second. Can folks, Marvin and everyone else, just mute would be great. Thank you. I'm sorry, Ravi, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think in this phase, it is very important to try many things, and I call those micro experiments. And you say you're not saying yes to everything. You're being retain an open mind to lots of different things, and you explore them a bit. And fairly soon you realize whether this is a worthwhile path, or a dead end. You think something is going to be enjoyable, and then after a little bit of time you realize it's really not as enjoyable as you thought it might be. Something else is. Some doors remain firmly shut. So let me give some examples concretely. So I tried experiments in the business arena. I also tried experiments in the social and development sector. And then I tried experiments in writing and teaching. So three different things, three different vectors. So on the business side, for instance, I said, I want to see if I can bring a global company to India, but not as an employee anymore like Microsoft, but as a principal. So I went and met Jeff Bezos at Amazon. This is way back 2011 or 12. And I said, look, you are not in India. You need to be in India, but you can't come in without an Indian partner under the rules of the government of India. So you will need an Indian partner. And, here's a person who's willing to put up the capital. And here's me who's done this a few times and so forth. It was a very promising conversation. And then nothing happened for a few months. And a year later, the Indian partner I'd put up said, hey, by the way, I want you to know that meeting with you arranged with Jeff was really good. We're going to do business together, except I didn't have a role. So like this, there were many dead ends. I wanted to start a tech company. I lined up all the venture capital for it. I had my team. And I realized I was doing this just because everybody else was starting their own tech company, and I didn't really have passion. And so in the 11th hour, I pulled out. I'm pointing out that I tried many things which didn't work out, but amongst the things that did work out were I joined the board of Infosys, which is a very phenomenally successful Indian company. I eventually became the co-chair. I led the turnaround of a huge Indian government-owned bank. So unexpected things came my way. So there were also many false starts and unsuccessful experiments. Same thing happened on the development side. Lots of things that I tried didn't work out, but the things that did work out were Rockefeller Foundation, where I am today. What did come out of that is the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which I chair today, which is hugely significant thing. So all I'm saying is you have to be open to ideas. You should follow your curiosity, try many experiments, know that 90% of them won't amount to anything, but out of them will come a few that become incredibly worthwhile, and then you double down on those and then prune away the rest. So it's a process.
So it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, Ravi, because there is, I mean, it does seem to me, though, looking at it from the outside, that there are some themes around entrepreneurship, around, youth entrepreneurship and role at UNICEF and so on around teaching leadership. Do you see that, or do you think it's really more, I mean, your description of it is really a sort of a set of isolated elements, or there's some kind of underlying golden threads, if you will, as you sort of think about things for yourself?
Again, good old Steve Jobs. He says you can connect the dots looking backwards, not forwards. So when you look back at time, you can begin to clearly see patterns and threads that connect these things. But in the moment, there isn't some grand plan that's unfolding. Okay.
Yeah.
So retrospectively, you can say, here's a clear theme, Ravi. That's what you were doing. Yeah, sure. but but I think in the moment, along the journey, you're trying different things. What connects them eventually is a strand. So for me, it's
Yeah.
about planet, it's about young people and entrepreneurship, it's about, empowering people to discover the leader within them. Yeah, I would say those are three strands. But it wasn't
Yeah.
obvious in 2011 that these are the ones that are going to emerge. If you'd asked me even in 2018, Russ, saying, oh, in 2023, here's what you're going to be doing, I wouldn't have believed you. Okay.
Right.
So things have a way of unfolding.
No, I'm curious, Ravi. I mean, we've talked a lot about the work side. What about, I mean, what about the rest of your life and the issue in some sense, in terms of balance, right? So it's kind of a key theme in this program is it's about crafting your life and your work. We talked about the work piece, in what ways, talk a bit about how your broader life changed or not, did you feel like you were creating more space or just working 120 hours doing different things? How did your life evolve sort of after you left, sort of more broadly than just on the work side?
Well, there was a time after I left Microsoft, maybe the first 2 years or 3 years, where there was a lot of time and space. And in fact, it felt sometimes there's too much time.
Hmm.
There's a problem with too much time, which is then the idle mind becomes the devil's workshop. It you tend to dwell on yourself. And every time you dwell on yourself, you're not necessarily the happiest. So, but certainly after the first 2, 3 years and discovering things I cared about, it's been intense. My personality is, as you know, unchanged in 35 years. I remain intense about everything I do. But I integrate everything into what I do. So I was never good at this work-life balance. In fact, I have never believed in it. I have tried to integrate everything I enjoy into what I do. So for instance, with my marriage to Sonali, I've tried to get her interested in some of the things that I do, which has not always been successful, but to the greatest extent possible, I talk about my work, talk about the challenges. She's been, life support for me throughout all these moments. I'm on a 3-week road trip right now, 1 week in the US, then London, then Dubai for 10 days. But I said, Sonali, why don't you come along? And so next week we're together in London. So that's how we keep the marriage going. I integrate my spirituality into everything I do. It's not something that's off to the side and separate. So for a long time, I've intentionally tried to integrate and weave in all these different aspects. I love dogs. So what, I'm in New York, I go to Central Park and get my fill of fur over there. So I'm just sort of saying, I don't look for balance. I look to integrate everything that's important to me along the way. I go to a city, I think about on work and think about who are 3 friends I've, miss over here. And I make sure I see them. That's why I called on you and Stephanie in those days. So again, you don't have time with friends separate from time at work. I try to connect the dots. It has worked well for me. I recognize it's not going to work well for everyone. So I'm not saying this is necessarily
Yes.
a recommendation. You have to find whatever suits you.
How you put the pieces together. So I want to go back over a couple of other. I mean, you know, what I love about your writing is that, and in general, is that you don't you're not afraid to be provocative. So there are a couple of things that you say in the book which are interesting. You know, one is that forget about jobs, right, and thinking about think about your career as a series of projects that add up to a portfolio over time. And, you know, a lot of us have spent our lives in particular roles and so on. And so that's a pretty radical statement. You just to say more about where that comes from and the implications.
Well, the world has changed so drastically that there is no such thing as a stable job. There are so many things that can happen. Your company could cease to exist, it could reorganize, and your job goes away. You get a new boss, and she doesn't like you. Whatever. You get replaced by AI. So there are 100 reasons why, you know, jobs are like bubbles. They're here today, not there tomorrow. And in fact, I gave a recent interview to Forbes, which went viral, at least in some parts of the world, where I said the riskiest thing is to have a job. And it was taken out of context because they said, isn't entrepreneurship and self-employment risky? I said, yeah, it is. But it's even riskier to have a job because there's so many factors outside your control. And so that's my point. I think the 21st century is totally different from the last century, in that these stable jobs leading to stable careers are going to be relevant to a smaller and smaller percentage of the world's population. If that is the case, what do you do? And I say, well, first of all, a job is important as a launch pad to whatever you do. So coming out of college, you know, the experience of good work is incredibly important. So you learn what you're good at, you learn some disciplines and social skills and all that. But as soon as possible thereafter, you should strike out on your own. At the very least, try and become self-employed, or better yet, become an entrepreneur and create livelihoods for a few more people. And even if you're in what you think is a job, think of it as a project. You're going to be, as a mental framing, it's way more constructive. You remember I was petrified of going to Microsoft in 2003. I was hugely excited on one hand, but it was a crazy company. And everybody, 10 out of 10 people said, don't join, you're going to fail. And I decided to frame it not as a job and a long career, but as a project, and said, oh, you know, it may last a year, it may last longer. Well, it lasted 8 years. So just as a mental framing, it's very valuable to see it as a project that leads to other projects. And then over time, you begin to see your whole life as a portfolio of projects that's evolving over time. I think this is an extraordinarily useful way of approaching it. Yeah.
So Ravi, you know, I see that as inspiring, inspiring advice if you're coming out of college and you're sort of thinking the pieces through. But, you know, another thing you say is that there's no such thing as retirement, you know, and I think the folks, Stephanie and I and the folks in this program, and at your point, I see more gray hairs now than there were before. You know, how do you, is it the same? Do you see it as the same story? Do you see it as a different, I mean, say a little bit more about what you mean by no such thing as retirement, and in some sense, sort of what does that look like in terms of putting the pieces together, kind of as you start moving on, you know, maybe to the latter part of your professional life and beyond?
Well, the main thing, Russ, is, you know, we're beginning to live much longer. So the idea of retiring at 60 and, you know, no longer makes any sense, both financially as well as in terms of energy and time. And so I think we need to be planning for much more, you know, productive lives, much longer. People talk about the third chapter and so on. And so yeah, so I think it's incredibly important to think about how you're going to remain productive as long as possible. You know, I looked after both my parents, and Sonali looked after her parents, and I saw something very remarkable. My father retired, and he was the extremely energetic and successful in the, you know, government. And then suddenly life came to a stall at 60, and he fell apart by 63. Okay.
Mm.
Um, my mother was was caring for him through his illness, and then he died. And suddenly she lost purpose, and within 2 years she was gone. Till then she was intense. She was this intense caregiver running everything. My father-in-law was a professor at an important business school. He was teaching till he was 90. Then his hearing failed him and he stopped teaching. And then he fell apart. So all I'm saying is, look, I've seen too many times that when people lose that sense of meaning and purpose to live for, they fall apart mentally or physically or both. And I think it's incredibly important to stay engaged. Of course, things are going to slow down. You know, of course, your body is going to not slow down. You won't have the same drive, energy, or necessarily the same mental faculties. But I think if you have this intense sense of purpose, you power through a lot of it, and the decline is less precipitous. That's why I say there's no such thing as retirement. And there's also so
Mm.
much the world needs so much. There's also the moral obligation to find ways to make it slightly better. But I don't want to get into morality. Just out of pure self-interest, I say keep going. You know, I'm sitting here in the offices of Rockefeller Foundation in New York, and one of the many things he said, good old robber baron that he said, a man must die in the saddle. Obviously, this is a gender insensitive comment made 90 years ago or whatever. But the point is, yeah, you've got to stay constructively engaged and busy. By the way, another thing he said is you must live your life in a way that your last check bounces. So give it all and just a little bit more.
I love that. That's terrific. So Ravi, one of the things that and it's come up a few times in this program. I think we've all been, the folks on this call in some ways have been very privileged. You've been very privileged. You're privileged by your sort of genetic makeup, and you're smart. You're privileged by your background, privileged relative to, a set of opportunities and what you've made of them. I mean, to what degree do you, and I also know that you've done a lot of work, with youth entrepreneurship in villages in India and, involved and engaged. And sort of to what degree do you feel like kind of the conversation we've been having is a conversation for the 1% or the 5% or whatever, or is it something much broader that, it doesn't really matter where you are on the scale relative to some of the things you discussed? And how do you think about that? Again, that issue of privilege.
I've got to think about that, but oddly, I don't think that the privilege matters beyond a point. Sure, if you're a girl in Afghanistan, or right now you're in Gaza or something, your circumstance, or South Sudan or someplace, your circumstances are just incredibly different. But if you're lower income or lower social strata and, in most reasonable parts of the world versus being really privileged, I think there's more in common than different, shockingly. And I spent many years with UNICEF driving our programs for young people in many parts of the world. So I've actually witnessed this. The biggest thing we all have to overcome is our own sense of fear and victimhood. Okay. So in helping young people from lower socioeconomic groups, the thing you have to get across to them somehow is to understand that no matter how difficult their circumstances, they have agency, they have choice. and they can take small steps, small decisions, rather than expect the system to improve or somebody to wait to be rescued. And once you get them thinking that way, they power their way out of their circumstance. When you're privileged, again, you've got all the freedom in the world except in your own head. You're held back by your own fears and anxieties, and so you refuse to take steps that you really ought to be able to. So I think we are held up by our own mindsets and beliefs and fears and insecurities to a much greater extent across all these strata. And that's what we all have to work on. And the only way to do that, I've learned in my own experience, is to confront your fears. And then when you confront your fear, you find most of the time it melts away. It's not real. It was imagined. It was manufactured by the mind. And therefore, when you confront it, it evaporates fairly quickly. So I don't know if I answered your question in any sensible manner, but I find much more in common across people, across socioeconomic and groups and countries and societies and cultures in this respect.
Yeah. So Ravi, I want to kind of create the space for folks to reflect on what you've had to say and then engage in Q&A. But I'm just curious, sort of as you look forward, right? And you describe things and you think about kind of the moving ahead, and maybe you'll say, look, you know, as you said for Gates, you have no idea where things are going. But do you have a sense about sort of what the future holds for you? Any sense of ways in which you see sort of the story evolving for you, or do you see it as kind of pretty much, you know, more of the same until it's not?
Well, if I look back at 60 years, very little of what I planned actually happened. Okay. So in business, there's this phrase that planning is important, but the plans are useless, right? But you have to engage in planning so you can prepare yourself for opportunities and contingencies that may arise. So what I imagined to be my future, where I imagined I would live, who I thought I would be with, none of those things have come true. But it has worked out more than all right. So,
Yes.
so right now, I'm not really planning anything. I've taken on 2, 3 very important pieces of work. At least I think it's important, and I'm giving it 110%. And I know that it'll lead to something. I'm wasting very little time imagining what will come next. Something always has come.
Yeah, that's great. So this is terrific. I would love to go on with this, but I want to create a space again for everyone to be engaging with you. So I'm going to stop